Have you ever asked yourself, what does it mean to be a good person? Or what sort of things should we do to be ethical? Are we supposed to be good for goodness sake? Or because we ought to uphold universal moral laws? Or promote happiness to the most possible people? What exactly are we supposed to do to be good? Many modern forms of ethics focus on actions we ought to perform, or consequences we ought to bring about, regardless of the motives and character of the person. Ethics reduces to mere actions. But what about the person who is performing ethical actions? Shouldn't ethics be about making people better than what they are instead of just doing good things? If a rich man donates to a charity only to avoid taxes, we can say his action was good, but his motives were misplaced. So can we really say he did something that made him more ethical? If someone with deep hatred pretends to be nice and kind only to appear moral so they fit in with the crowd, can we really say they are improving ethically because their actions appear good? Ethics should be about making people better, or perhaps we could say making people more virtuous. It should not only be about performing certain actions or bringing about certain results. Ethics should also focus on what it means to be a good person and live a flourishing, meaningful life. Because of this, I'd like to argue that you should adopt virtue ethics and become a virtue ethicist. Virtue ethics is one of the major branches of normative ethics. The other two major views are deontology and consequentialism, which I won't have time to cover in depth. Consequentialist theories believe the rightness or wrongness of an action depends solely on the action's outcome or result. So for example, according to some theories, if an action were to increase happiness for the majority of people, then it is the right thing to do, regardless of the moral status of the action itself. Deontological theories instead argue the rightness or wrongness of an action should be based on whether that action itself is right or wrong, as dictated by moral laws. So for example, an action is wrong regardless of the outcome. If murdering one person would increase the happiness for the majority of people, it would still be wrong, regardless of the consequences it created. Virtue ethical theories argue these different views are incomplete in describing what ethics is or should be. One of the most influential critics of modern forms of ethics in the Western tradition was presented by Elizabeth Anscombe. She advocated for a return to an Aristotelian understanding of ethics, where the aim is to focus on building a virtuous character and to live a flourishing human life, which goes beyond merely performing right actions. Performing one's duty or bringing about certain consequences are only aspects of what it means to be a virtuous person. In other words, if ethics is simply following rules from proper reasoning, or universally applicable principles, then one should be moral regardless of their character, emotions, or who they are as a person. But intuitively, we feel as though that someone who does good actions for the wrong reasons is not really moral, but a fraud. For instance, take a politician who passes a law that results in increased medical care for children. The law is effective and everyone benefits. But suppose we found out a year later the politician only passed this policy because he is a shareholder in a medical supply company, and he gained an exorbitant amount of wealth from the law he passed. Private emails revealed he didn't care whether it helped children, he only cared about growing his wealth. So we would think his actions stem from greed and not from a virtuous character, regardless of the fact that his actions brought about a good consequence, or was the right action to take. We would still think the politician was an immoral person. But this analogy implies ethics is more than merely performing proper actions. It requires proper motivations and a virtuous character, not just some examples or a series of a few good actions or consequences. Bernard Williams presented an interesting analogy against a form of consequentialism called act utilitarianism. Here I'll attempt to apply Williams' analogy more broadly to encompass more of ethical thought. Williams suggests we imagine a man named Jim who finds himself in South America, tied up with 20 other prisoners. The captors realize G.E.M is there by accident. The other prisoners are indigenous habitants who protested the government and will be executed on the spot. But the lead captor, Pedro, decides to give G.E.M an ultimatum. G.E.M can kill one native and the others will go free. If G.E.M refuses, all 20 natives will be executed. Now Williams acknowledges, given there are no other factors, that the right action very likely is to kill one native so the other 19 go free. But his point is, if ethics is merely performing right actions, then G.E.M should not feel remorse or sadness about the event. After all, he did the moral thing. Isn't that all that matters? Williams says no. What matters as well is how it affects G.E.M and his reaction as well. G.E.M should be grieved by the situation, even if he does the right thing. The right response for G.E.M should include sadness over the death of the indigenous person. The point being, ethics encompasses more than what we ought to do, and includes things like our emotions, motives, and character. Virtue ethical theories focus primarily on the character of the person. We ought to focus on being a virtuous person, and then right actions will flow from being a virtuous agent. Our primary aim should be concerned with what does it mean to live a good life, and what does it mean to be virtuous. Then, right and proper actions will follow naturally. In other words, it's about having the appropriate inner state and placing oneself in the right kind of environment that can properly nurture the person. So we should focus on certain virtues or qualities we ought to exemplify, not just performing actions regardless of the character of the person. As Anscombe said, it would be a great improvement if instead of morally wrong, one always named a genus such as untruthful, unchaste, unjust. We should no longer ask whether doing something was wrong, passing directly from some description of an action to this notion. We should ask whether, e.g., it was unjust, and the answer would sometimes be clear at once. The idea is that one can perform right actions without actually being virtuous. But we should want to be what it is to be virtuous. To be altruistic involves more than doing good things. It includes empathizing with someone, having the right kind of emotions and motivations. If one does a good action for selfish reasons, like with the example of the politician from earlier, then they are really not altruistic. They only mimic a virtuous character. To be altruistic, in other words, requires having one's heart and head in the right place, not just your actions. Another important aspect of ethics is the overall aim of what ethics is supposed to do. Deontological and consequentialist theories say the aim is to direct action, but intuitively, it feels as though ethics is supposed to do more, namely to tell you how to live a good life as a whole. Living is more than actions. Living includes things like feeling good about yourself, finding meaning, and growing in wisdom. Virtue ethics is different because it says the aim of ethics is to live a good life. Aristotle used the term eudaimonia to describe what the aim of ethics is. Namely, one is supposed to live a eudaimonious life. Richard Kraut says, being eudaimon is the highest end, and all subordinate goals, health, wealth, and other resources, are sought because they promote well-being, not because they are what well-being consists in. So according to virtue ethics, the aim of ethics should be more than telling us what a right action is. The aim of ethics is to live a good life in all ways, beyond mere actions. Anscombe once said that every action we take is a moral action. Now when I first read this, I was puzzled. How could something like eating a piece of fruit or tying my shoes be a moral action? But the problem was, I was still thinking in terms of the other views of ethics, where it's about directing certain actions to take in moral dilemmas. Under virtue ethics, every action is an aspect of living, whether or not we are living a good, eudaimonious life. In other words, everything we do contributes to the type of life we want to live, at least in some small way. Since virtue ethics focuses more on living a good life and not just directing certain actions, then on this understanding, every action is a moral action, because moral actions are defined as advancing a good life or not. nourishing my body instead of giving in to gluttony contributes to living a good life. Taking time to properly dress for the day contributes to living a good life and not giving in to laziness or sloth. So all actions can be moral actions in this context. Everything we do contributes to living a good life or not living a good life. Now your mind may want to make you jump to deriving rules from this understanding. Notice one example I gave was that of nourishing your body. So perhaps you might be tempted to say it's always immoral to eat junk food, but this would be inaccurate. Virtue ethics emphasizes the importance of avoiding making universal rules like this, because such rules cannot fully cover the complexity of all the moral situations we might find ourselves in. Sometimes eating a snack reduces anxiety and can make a person feel relaxed. Sometimes it's fine to overeat a little, and sometimes we need to eat healthier. Given the complexity of human experience and our psychological makeup, no two circumstances will ever be the same. As Heraclitus said, you cannot step into the same river twice. And applying a universal rule or principle like this to guide our actions will ultimately never cover every possible circumstance. We are constantly faced with problems where the right answer is going to depend on an intimate evaluation of our circumstances. And also, just as important, the answer to each problem will also be different depending on the person. The virtuous action to take for an old lady who encounters a robbery will be different for a police officer. The right food to eat will be different for a person with a slower metabolism than someone with a higher metabolism. The right job for an introvert will not be the right job for an extrovert. The virtues one ought to exemplify will also be different. Bravery might be the perfect virtue to exemplify for a soldier on a battlefield, but meekness might be the appropriate response for dealing with a family member that hurt you. So we also have to acknowledge pluralism when it comes to what it means to live a good life. What is the right life to live for me may not be the right life to live for someone who is more charismatic and extroverted. Now again, this does not mean the extreme understanding of this idea, which is pure relativism. We have to do our best to avoid universalizing from the tenets of virtue ethics. The fact that there are multiple ways to live a good life doesn't mean there are endless ways to live a good life. For virtue ethics, there can be general rules of thumb or guidelines that are true for the most part, but these only go so far. The objective guiding principle is to live a flourishing life and conform to what it means to be a virtuous human, and want us to learn what that means throughout life, not simply make it up to suit your desires or fantasies. Of course, by now you might be thinking of the biggest objection to virtue ethics, which is that there are no action guiding rules. How am I to know what to do or how to act? Should I aim to increase happiness or follow strict moral rules? What exactly are we supposed to do under virtue ethics? And what actions should we perform to actually live a good life? The answer is to simply stop thinking in those terms. To do so is to assume actions are the aim of ethics, when the aim ought to be more about how to become a virtuous person and live a good life. And sometimes you don't need to perform actions to do that. Sometimes you have to perform certain actions, but it is impossible to know what to do unless the person in those circumstances actually takes into consideration their own psychology, the background knowledge of how they got there, all the contributing factors, and the knowledge of the other people involved. Sometimes the answer might be to increase happiness. Sometimes it might be to uphold certain moral principles, regardless of how it makes someone feel. The virtuous person can draw from their experience to know what the right answer is. Virtue ethics cannot give simple answers, because in reality, these answers do not exist. Virtue ethics acknowledges this fact about reality, instead of pretending generalized principles can always cover all aspects of life. An important thing to remember is for someone like Kant, ethics can be done from the armchair. We can reason out right and wrong actions simply by proposing hypothetical scenarios and inferring what is the universal law we ought to follow. For Aristotle and virtue ethicists, ethics cannot be done this way. Instead, ethics is something we learn through experience. We have to be in the actual scenario to know the proper and right action to take. Deriving laws from mere hypotheticals could provide the right action to take in simple scenarios, but it cannot truly dictate what all actions should be or guide every action through the complexity of life. Instead, virtue ethics is about realizing that acquiring virtues will give you the appropriate tools to act. If you obtain the virtue of kindness, you will know the kind thing to do in a situation and naturally act accordingly. If you have the virtue of gentleness, you will know the gentle way to handle a situation and naturally act accordingly. To help explain this, Julia Annis compares virtues to practical skills. Think of the skill of cooking. If someone has this skill, they know what to do regardless of if there is a recipe. A professional cook could be given ingredients, placed in a kitchen, and be able to make something. They may have certain guidelines that they could apply to certain circumstances, like cheese and fish do not typically go together. But what to actually make will depend on the circumstances, not laws like always serve meat or never make anything spicy. In a similar way, having something like the virtue of kindness means you understand what it is to be kind and know how to apply it when the virtue calls for it. You don't need instructions or rules to tell you to act kind. You know how to apply the virtue in different situations. In other words, you become a law unto yourself. Now, unlike mere practical skills, virtues come with dispositions, which involve one moving to act in accord with them. So applying the virtue of kindness and realizing the right response in a specific setting will lead one to act kindly, not only the knowledge one ought to act kindly. As Julia Annis says, virtue is a lasting feature of a person, a tendency for the person to be a certain way. It is not merely a lasting feature, however, one that just sits there undisturbed. It is active. To have it is to be disposed to act in certain ways, and it develops through selective responses to circumstances. Now, like when it comes to obtaining practical skills, obtaining virtues requires experience and training. A key feature of virtue ethics is that the way we learn how to be virtuous is by following or learning from more experienced virtuous people. Aristotle taught, "You will learn what is noble from noble people." Ethics is not something we can do from the armchair. It requires we learn from experts in real-life experience. As Aryeh Kosman said, virtue is itself shaped by the impersonation of the virtuous. Like with learning practical skills, the best way to learn to be virtuous is to be trained by an expert. Someone trained by an expert electrician will understand the profession better than someone who attempts to learn by just reading a textbook. We understand actively employing the skills in real situations under the wing of an expert is the best way to learn the skill. Likewise, the best way to learn how to be a virtuous person is not following principles or moral rules, but to learn how to live and act from a more experienced agent. This is Julia Annis's point when she says, as with skill, we learn from a teacher or a role model who shows us how to do something, which we then try to copy for ourselves. We don't learn to be virtuous from books, even books about virtue, though these help our understanding. So virtue ethics does offer some guidance on how to live a virtuous life. It is just that rules are not necessarily specified ahead of time. One learns how to live and act virtuously through experience and the imitation of experts of virtue. This process gives us better guidance on how to live and act, instead of beginning with universal laws or principles to guide our actions. Now, this doesn't mean that there are no moral universals. One can still come to the realization that certain actions can never flow from a virtuous character. Aristotle noted that for some actions, no qualifications could make them virtuous. But not every action or feeling admits of a mean, for some have names immediately connected with depravity, such as spite, shamelessness, envy, and among actions, adultery, theft, homicide. All these and others like them are so called because they themselves, and not their excesses or deficiencies, are bad. In their case then, one can never hit the mark, but always misses. Something like rape is still universally wrong from a virtue ethical framework, because such an action could never flow from a virtuous character. So one does not need to assume within virtue ethics, universals can never be derived. The difference is, on virtue ethics, we do not start with universal laws. Instead, we start with what a virtuous character is, and once we understand this, then we can know what actions would or would not flow from such an ideal. So it's not like virtue ethics leads to the idea there are no universal truths about ethics. We simply note the difference in how they are derived. We've only scratched the surface with this video. I've not even discussed the different types of virtue ethics or thoroughly addressed every objection. In an upcoming video, I'll be presenting the specific virtue ethical theory that I hold to. But I hope I've offered an interesting introduction to virtue ethics and why it should be considered as a normative theory that you should adopt. Instead of worrying about actions we ought to perform to be moral, we should be looking to a theory that teaches us how to live and flourish as human beings. Virtue ethics offers a more promising path forward for us.